Good morning. I hope you had a restful night and good memories from yesterday. We will be starting today with a keynote lecture that will be delivered by our special guest, Klaus Welle, that does not need introduction. And some of you were already privileged to meet with Klaus in Jean Monnet House as part of this project. So it's our greatest pleasure that you accepted our invitation to join us today and to deliver a keynote on future and challenges to European democracy. Klaus Welle is a German politician, and he served for many years as Secretary General of the European Parliament. Previously, he was engaged with Christian Democratic Union of Germany party, and he also served as head of the office of the President of the European Parliament, Hans-Gert Pöttering. Currently, Klaus Welle is visiting professor at KU Leuven and guest professor in practice of London School of Economics, and he's also engaged with Martin Center. It's our greatest pleasure, again, to have you with us. We'll start with a lecture, followed by a stellar panel of scholars and practitioners who will comment and engage in dialogue with Klaus' ideas. All of this will be chaired by Katarzyna Zielińska from Institute of Sociology of Jagiellonian University. Thank you very much. The Klaus floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction. So I'm speaking about challenges to European democracy, and I would like to qualify this a little bit. European democracy, when I'm speaking about, I mean European Union democracy. I will also, given that this is here a scientific gathering, try to speak in as structured a way possible, so not just ad hoc impressions. And maybe I should say in advance that if anybody is unhappy with what I'm saying, it's all the fault of Sergio Fabrini, by whom I'm still very much influenced with his book, Compound Democracy from 2006. So in that case, I asked Sergio to support me a little bit. So the first question is, if we speak of challenges, that we should try to understand what is the appropriate model of organization for an entity like the European Union. Because if we don't know that, it's very difficult to say why there are shortcomings or whether there are shortcomings. And I think every entity has to properly reflect the conditions of its own coming into existence. It must make a huge difference whether you are having a small unitary state and to organize the democratic function in there, or whether it's something else. So the first thing is to find out what are the special conditions for the existence and well-functioning of the European Union. I would like to start with that the European Union has to organize a multinational and continental space. When I say continental, we are a bit generous because it's the most western end of that European continent. But it's still a space which is of continental size, which is multinational, and in size it can probably only be compared with the United States or India. So that means we are having a very specific challenge here, which is not easily comparable to many of the other examples we know. Therefore, also that space is diverse in language, history, culture, religious beliefs, and economic and social development. What is also important is that the European Union is a voluntary association. So people are there, countries are there because of their free will. And not only that they have entered voluntarily, they can also exit. That means that entity, the European Union, has to systematically reflect and take into account the divergences that are constituting that space. If not, the outcome will not be very happy. So what is the appropriate form then to organize such a space? I would argue that the appropriate form to organize such a space is and has to be federal. So I'm using the F word, federal. Federal in the sense of distributing, dividing, decision-making functions. So if you have a space that's huge, continental, that's multinational, where people are there because of their free will, you cannot establish a system which is functioning with 51 against 49, and then the 49 simply have to adapt. You have to organize already the process of decision-making in a very different way, and in a way that everybody gets a hearing. Even if then you're put into a minority, you will want to know that you had the chance to make your argument, and if possible, several times. That means it needs a division of power system, not a fusion of power system, a division of power system, which is characterized by permanent negotiation of the entities that establish that political system. It also means that it has to be pluralist. It has to be pluralist inside, but it has also got to be pluralist among member states. You cannot impose uniformity. And that's a debate which we know very well from the United States, you have to respect state rights. What it then means to respect state rights, that's a question for debate, but state rights will be always very much under discussion. And when we have a look at the debates around the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, of course we can have a look at it thinking of left and right division, and that's correct. But it's also, and maybe equally, and at the same time, a division about state rights. So, are the state rights sufficiently respected, or are they not sufficiently respected? And that's then the famous debate about the framers. Is this what the framers originally wanted, or what they didn't want? So, in federal systems, you automatically have a permanent debate about what are the rights of the states, the constituting states that have established that entity, and what is properly established on the federated level. So now it will not come as a big surprise when I say, how is the democratic system of the European Union organized? It's organized as a division of power system when it comes to the democratic functions. That means we have no permanent majorities for the Commission. Everything has to be always to be negotiated, and everything is negotiated with open outcome between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. When in a national system a government is proposing something, it has the legitimate expectation that if it is important enough, that it will be endorsed by its own parliamentary majority. And if that parliamentary majority is no longer endorsing it, then normally Parliament is dissolved, the government resigns, there are new elections, and that state of fusion of power is being re-established after the election. That's not at all our situation. I mean, our situation, I would say, in standard is the Commission proposes something, Parliament has roughly 1,000 amendments. If we are nice, it's only 250. And then we try to find somehow a solution with the Council, but with open outcome. It can also be refused. It can be delayed. All the possibilities that are there. So we are in a division of power system horizontally on the federated level. But we are equally in a division of power system vertically between the institutions on the union level and the states and the citizens. Why is this, are these preliminary remarks important? Because it gives us an indication what we should look at. My background is very much the European Parliament, so probably I would be pardoned if I would look at mainly at the European Parliament. But in a division of power system, the democratic function is not just with the Parliament. The democratic function is divided twice between the Parliament as the chamber of the citizens and the Council of Ministers as the chamber of the states, and equally between the federated level and the federating level, that means the national parliaments, which sometimes are organized as unicameral and sometimes are organized as bicameral. So in order to analyze challenges to the democratic system, I cannot limit myself now to the European Parliament, but we have to look at the Chamber of the Citizens, the European Parliament, the Chamber of the States, the Council of Ministers, but we also have to look at the national level, at national parliaments in their specific situation. So, what kind of challenges can we speak about? In principle, I would think we can divide them into two types. First, the challenges which are linked to the system chosen. So what are the specific challenges to the democratic function if you are in a division of power system? So these challenges are normal. They are system inherent. They won't go away. And they are not pathological. And then you can have a look at the challenges which are because of malfunctioning of the system. And that could be on the level of the individual institution. That could also be in the interplay of different institutions. That could be because of challenges to the system overall. And that could also be because of external challenges. So, what are the challenges of the EU democratic division of power system when functioning normally? Won't go away. First, it's very slow. It's very slow because we want to give everybody a hearing. We need to give everybody a hearing because that's the precondition for acceptance. And I remember from my student times, there was an article, from Albert O. Hirschman. The short form is voice or exit. I know it's a bit longer. Huh? Yes. That's basically the issue. You don't give voice, you don't get loyalty, but you might be getting exit. So it has to be taken slowly, but the advantage is once a decision is taken, it's very solid. And that's what the British government also had to find out when they did, during the Brexit debate, they did an evaluation where have been transgressions and what is not really compatible with the principle of subsidiarity. And they came up with so little that they had to keep the study in the drawer. Because it's so complicated to take a decision, and it's so slow and complicated, and you listen to everybody, that you don't find so many obvious transgressions. Maybe your own position has not prevailed, but transgressions are rare. The second limitation of our system is that the principal model behind the construction is still growing the cake. I'm saying as a former economist. So the idea is we are growing the cake together. That means through cooperation, the cake is growing. And the internal market is the prime example. Everybody is better off. That's the basic assumption. And as long as we are in the territory of growing the cake, things are relatively easy. But that also means if we are leaving the territory of growing the cake and we are going to redistributing the cake, we have problems. Why do we have problems? We have problems because we are working on the basis of limited common identity. Those who have studied this and know better than me, and I of course hope that it has dramatically changed, but I'm not so sure. They are saying that only, let's say, 5 to 10% of the population feels first European. The other ones have first a national identity and then a complementary European identity, which is maybe 30, 40% of European citizens saying this. So that means identity is a growth limiting factor for what we are doing in the European Union. We have difficulty in scenarios where we would need identity to redistribute the cake. So we are staying in the model of growing the cake together. And whenever it's about redistribution, that can be budget negotiations, for example, MFF, it's difficult, painful, and so on. Or refugees. When we want to discuss redistribution of refugees, it's kind of redistributive, very, very difficult. So where do we find agreements? On the border. The policy answers move to the border because that avoids redistributive issues. Also, cultural and religious pluralism must be respected. Sometimes we are better in this, sometimes we are worse. But I would like to remind, for example, that we were for a very long time very tolerant with Ireland. Ireland has a very, had at least a very strong Catholic background. And therefore they insisted that in Ireland, for example, abortion laws or also laws for divorce would be very different from what we had in the European Union. We were able to respect this, and we've seen that over time the position in Ireland moved. But it was not a precondition for working together. And I think that same respect for pluralism is necessarily linked to the existence of a European Union on that basis. And just as a side remark, when you look at another federal system, the United States, the divergence they have to accept, let's say, between beliefs in New York and Alabama is surely not smaller than what we have to endure. Also, when exit is a possibility, then the aggregate is not decisive, but the weakest link. So we like to look, of course, at Eurobarometer figures. Are people happy with the European Union? The figures are relatively good. They are maybe relatively close to, let's say, their high points. But in such a system, the aggregate doesn't save you. It's the weakest link that is decisive. Because it's potentially the weakest link that you're going to lose. We lost our weakest link, which was Britain. The aggregate didn't rescue us. Then it seemed that the next weakest link would be Italy. But Italy, the mood towards the European Union has very much shifted. But policy making also has to have a very close look at the weakest link. Because if the weakest link is unhappy, you might lose that weakest link in a system where exit is a possibility. And of course, you're dependent on the loyal cooperation of member states in implementation. So these are the system inherent elements we have to take into account. So where could we find malfunctioning of the institutions or the interplay or the system overall, even if we take on board that we are in a division of power system? So I try to find one for each institution. Unfortunately for Council I had 3, so sorry. Can't help it, Next time invite somebody from Council, he will have immediately 3 for the European Parliament. But if I have a look at Parliament, I have the impression, especially in this legislature, that there is a danger of renationalization. I could say danger from my own point of view, but let's say danger from a system point of view. Why is renationalization in Parliament a danger from the system point of view? Because the nation is already represented. That's what we have Council for. So you don't want it to be represented twice. In Parliament, you need to have another kind of representation and not the one which is already happening on the Council side. So my impression is that some governments have tried to gain control of some of the political groups and their leaderships. I will now not say explicitly which ones, but you also need to use your own. You also need to use your own imagination. Why is this? Because we are time-wise in N+1. N+1 after the first successful introduction of Spitzenkandidaten. In N, governments were sleepy, fortunately. I've been given 2013, 2014, a lot of talks about Spitzenkandidaten and did my best to make myself a laughingstock, which I was. So they said, ridiculous idea, will never happen, completely excluded. In the situation N+1, we cannot expect the same sleepiness, so governments try to have an impact. Shouldn't say take control, but take control as much as possible, so that this is never happening. Again. So we always have to assume learning. On the Council, I have the impression, but that might be my own limited knowledge, that there is insufficient attention given to the democratic functioning in Council. And I would like to say what are, from my point of view, the points that need to be discussed. First, in Council we have the very special situation that executives legislate. normally executives don't legislate. The only bad exception is Germany, where we have the Bundesrat, where executives legislate. That goes to all the other member states. You have even if it's a two-chamber system, you have a Senate, you have members of parliament that legislate. You don't have executives that legislate. You don't have regions that legislate directly. You have senators, members of parliament that legislate. Of course, we have also the example from the United States, where until 1913 you did not have directly elected senators, but you had representatives from the individual states, which we should take as an encouragement. So there is hope. Change in the system is a possibility. So we have this situation that executives legislate, but we have to further, let's say, worsen that description. There are a number of council formations, and now this is not my judgment, but it's the judgment of my peers on the council secretariat side, which have to be considered as non-functioning. I'm not saying not functioning well, but basically non-functioning. You have some which are functioning very well. Agriculture, there's a lot to be decided and divided. Finance ministries, very well, and so on. But it seems there are a number of council formations which, at least inside the council, are regarded as dysfunctional. And de facto, the system is not run by ministers, but by COREPER. COREPER is the decisive body, from my point of view, on the council side. That means we have an executive that legislates, but maybe in reality on a high-level civil servant level. Then I leave it to everybody whether you think this is a problem or not a problem. I've been myself a high-level civil servant, so I have a lot of respect for these kind of people. But at least it should raise a number of question marks. And what's further complicating this issue is that it could be that these executives, when they are legislating, are very well controlled by their national parliaments. But unfortunately, these executives are coming out of fusion of power systems. And in a fusion of power system, parliaments are very reluctant to properly control their executives. So it's not only that we have executives who are legislating, not only that we have council formations who are basically defunct, not only that maybe it's rather the legislative function with high-level civil servants, but also the control function we would assume to be conducted by national parliaments is very unlikely to be conducted because they are coming out of fusion of power systems. So what to do about it? Of course, I could make it easier and say, look, you have to research it, you have to engage. It's true, you have to research it, you have to engage. But I would like to say we need a debate if we see the council as the other legislative chamber which is legislating in this way, about what are minimum democratic standards to be guaranteed in a legislative first chamber of executives. I think that would be a useful reflection. If this is the case, and if this will remain the case for the foreseeable future, what are minimum standards we expect this legislative chamber to respect? And in the conclusion, I will add one more element here. So, what could be regarded as malfunctioning in the Commission? Whether it's then malfunctioning or not, I can leave to you. But my observation is that collegiate leadership is replaced by presidentialism in the European Commission. If I say presidentialism, probably it would be better to say kind of prime minister style. The rising number of commissioners, now 27, in the world of economy, we would have described as inflation. No? You cannot expect that if you increase the numbers and basically you have the same thing to share, that it has the same value. The value of the individual decreases. So 27 commissioners normally and automatically will have less of a say. We also know that optimum group size is considered to be around 7, not 27. So interaction is easiest in a group of 7, 8, we can discuss this, but it's not easiest in a group of 27. In the European Commission, you will see a photo of the first Commissioners' College. And it's fascinating because they were sitting around a round table. As long as you can be sitting around a round table, you have a real exchange. If you have a look at the Commissioners' College room now, it's on 4 ends, and there's a huge hole in between, and people need microphones. Just to say what are the consequences of size. So the advantage is everybody is at the table, but we should have no illusions. Not everybody is in power. So everybody is at the table, but not everybody is in power. What can we do about it? Is a fair alternative possible? I think that question becomes more urgent because with any additional enlargement, that number will increase. Of course, it can be that member states will prefer to at least have a commissioner and be at the table, even though they are not in power. It could be, and that therefore the current arrangement is stable. But if we are looking for anything else, then I would like to say that the precondition is the acceptance that there is no guarantee for nobody. I remember the debates that were there probably around Lisbon on the number of commissioners. And my own country, Germany, was saying, yes, we need to reduce the number, and Germany should have 1, and the other should rotate. That's not working. That's not working. The only possible alternative is no guarantees for nobody, and the Commission President composes her or his team with the size they regard necessary. And then they are looking, as it is now, for majorities, both in the European Council and in the European Parliament. If that's the system, a Commission President-elect will have all interest anyhow, at least to have a fair balancing out across the regions. But if anybody is asking for guarantees in advance, it will not work. So what is the problem in Council? Or maybe it's not a problem. That's the discussion we can have. Or we could also say, what is the important change? From my point of view, the important change is that 15 years ago, we were discussing about competence catalogs. And we wanted that everything is sorted out in detail and you can go to court if there's any transgression and so on. I think how the European Council is now functioning can be described as can-do approach. So the European Council believes that there is a huge problem and that problem needs to be addressed. You can be sure it will address it. And if it is not possible within the treaty, it will create an instrument that allows it to be addressed outside the treaties with an intergovernmental construction, for example. So we have a completely different way to look at the action possible on the European Union. Instead of looking at the treaty and taking this as the final verdict, of course also dependent on the lawyers you ask, and then dependent on the situation. If you're on a Sunday and the question is, can we open the banks on Monday, you might be a bit more generous in your interpretation of the text. But I think what has fundamentally changed is that the European Council has moved to can do and finds itself the legal basis that allows it to do what it wants to do, and if really important and really necessary, it will go to intergovernmental. So what can we do about it? In the actual situation, not much, but at least we should try to codify afterwards. I remember that for one of these big financial instruments that were created in the financial crisis, I don't know anymore which one, the European Council decided that 5 years after, it should be integrated into the treaties. Nothing has happened. It has not been integrated into the treaties. I'm not even aware of an attempt to integrate it into the treaties. Secondly, where we found out that we are at the legal borderline, but still in the treaties, I think we need sectoral treaty change, and that's probably the case for issues of health and defense. On the level of the member states, malfunctioning. So there we are quickly in the discussion about Article 7. So what is the problem? The problem is that in some of the member states, the internal systems of checks and balances have been systematically weakened. Can be different things. That can be the legal system. That can also be the, the structure of the media when they're taken over by friends, or you don't have the variety in the media anymore. And I think we have found out, at least that's my impression, that Article 7 is not a very strong weapon, because you easily find one other member state who feels that they might be the next in line, who is then supporting you. So personally, I think that the move, which is also justified, to address the issue via the budget is relatively successful. If we take the case of Hungary, I think Hungary is still waiting for 7.4 billion, if I know the figure correctly, euros. They recently changed some of the criticized legal base, and the Commission said, thank you very much, 4 are changed, 21 are still outstanding. I don't know whether it will lead to the outcome, but I think at least it's giving a fair chance to have real leverage. So what about national parliaments? National parliaments are in fusion of power systems, which means they execute limited control of their own executives in general. If I take, a very well-respected national parliament like the Bundestag, they explained to me they will only become active on the base of a government document. No. And governments have also been quite skillful to create interest among leading parliamentarians to be in line, state secretary, you might get a double salary and so on. So what can be done about it? I participated over nearly 14 years as Secretary General of the European Parliament in these meetings with presidents of national parliaments and so on. And what is striking is how different they are. Very often the meeting starts with 2 or 3 presidents of parliament declaring, sorry, I cannot express myself politically. If they can say nothing political, are they going to talk about administration? I hope not. So Where are the good examples? I think we all know the good examples are rather in the north. We could say Denmark, but I would prefer Finland, because Denmark is a special case because they are minority governments more or less permanently. So that's not easy to transmit to the rest. Finland does not have a tradition of minority governments. On the contrary, these are majority governments. But they are pooling sufficient power in the national system to have a real impact on government with the Grand Committee, where you have the leading committee chairs, so those who have a strong standing of their own, which are forcing the government to listen and making the government report. So if I should advise national parliaments, I would say they should try to develop, I'm not recommending Finlandization, no? But they should try to develop a kind of gold standard for the relation between parliaments and their national executives. In the absence of that, it will be very, very difficult individually, but also collectively. Because if you're so different, how can you organize common action? It's not possible. Of course, when we are speaking about malfunction and, crisis-driven and, jumping out of the constitutional framework, we are already putting ourselves in the position of last moment. And last moment, very often, not much can be done. So it can also be an interesting question to avoid malfunctioning of the system overall. How do parliaments avoid to always address issues last moment? So aren't there possibilities for parliament to help the system to be a bit more forward-looking, to be anticipating issues, and therefore to avoid that the overall system is always only addressing the big things at the very last moment? And I would like to mention 3 content tools we have been developing in the European Parliament, or at least pushing very much by the European Parliament, just to complete the picture. The one is restarting 10 years ago the idea of cost of non-Europe. That's the instrument for the optimists. So what should we do in order to create growth without debt, could avoid certain situations? Maybe as importantly, maybe more importantly, we started something new in the last year, which I call risk capabilities and midterm planning. We try to systematically evaluate risk on a scale of less likely to happen or very likely to happen, sectoral effects only or systemic effects. The outcome are 4 quadrants, and the 4th quadrant is very interesting. Risk very likely to happen with systemic impact. These are the kind of issues that are landing in the European Council for emergency decision making. How can you identify those risks? You can try yourself. We all have gut feelings. It's one possibility. But there is another source which I think is very interesting, and that's the reinsurance industry. Not the insurance industry, but the reinsurance industry, because the reinsurance industry is there to protect insurance companies from major risks. Can be political, can be an earthquake, can be the explosion of a nuclear power plant, and so on. And they all have staff of thousands of risk analysts, and if they get it wrong, they are bankrupt. So for me, that's a good, a good basis to assume that they are serious about what they are doing, especially after 100 years of existence. And this is publicly available material. So you can classify risk very likely to happen with systemic impact. Second step, have a look at, do we have tools to deal with them? Legislative or financial? If the answer is yes, we are calming down. If the answer is no, there are systemic risks very likely to happen, and we have no tools to deal with them, neither nationally nor on the European level, that means we should bother to create them. And that means we could have a consensual way to agree between the institutions what we should do, what we should put into our midterm planning. And when you have a look at the treaty, it says that the European Commission initiates the annual and multi-annual programming of the Union with a view to reach interinstitutional agreement. What don't we have? Multi-annual planning. We have annual programming, but we don't have multi-annual, except if we assume that the document coming out of the European Council just after the European elections is already the planning for everybody. But it's not representing the interinstitutional agreement. So what I'm suggesting is that if we want to avoid to get into the situation which we like to deplore, that the European Council has to take last-minute urgency decisions because a major catastrophe has been happening, we should do systematic work on risk, capabilities, and mid-term planning. And just a hint in a new function which I'm now having as the chair of the Academic Council of the Martin Center. We've come up with a paper which is called the 7 Ds, trying to identify where sustainability is at risk. So where is sustainability at risk? The 7 Ds. Of course, it's also nice marketing. Huh? 7 Ds, defense, digital, debt, democracy, demography, decarbonization, and de-risking globalization. We had to leave out some other issues because I didn't start with D. You know? But the paper is downloadable. But it's also meant as a contribution to understand unsustainable situations in advance and not have to complain that because nothing was done, the European Council is improvising at the very end and maybe using intergovernmental tools. So what are the external challenges? I started in 2021 as a visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven, and they asked me to do something to speak about geopolitics. Okay, so try to read a little bit into and try to understand it better. And concerning that issue, you find out immediately all the shortcomings and the dangers, you know, especially if you're a German. But also the geopolitical advice in Versailles was not the very best. Anyhow. But if you take it, if you accept it for a moment, and you look therefore on the European map, because this is what geopoliticians do, then you see that the European continent is structured by 2 principles and 2 principles only. The Federal Union of Citizens and States in the West and in the center, and empire represented by Russia in the East. And I know that not everybody in the West and in the center is a member of the European Union, but even if you are not a member, you can't avoid anymore to enter into strong contractual relations. Norwegians know this, Swiss know this, and the British are about to learn it right now. And there's very little space left in between. That's Ukraine, and that's in Moldova, and Ukraine, that's the territory of military conflict. So the war in Ukraine, from my point of view, is a war about which rules are to be applied in the future on the European continent. And the choice is basically, should we go back to the 19th century empire, which is not just Russia, but it's also our own past. We are speaking about ourselves. Do we want these rules to be applicable again? Or do we prefer the rules of the 21st century? That's the basic question. And we've more or less all been empires. I could entertain the previous chair of the European Bishops' Conference, who's from Luxembourg, with the idea that also Luxembourg was an empire, even though you have to go 1,000 years back into the past, you know, right after the division into three of the empire of the space of Charlemagne. So there are these principles which are structuring the European space only, and therefore we will have to add to defense, which is expensive. We will have to invest into decarbonization, which maybe in the long term is a profit, but in the short term is very expensive. We will have to spend on demography, because it's not very favorable where we are now, and we already have very high debt levels. So that means the external threat is adding to the internal challenges we are having, and that's a feast for what traditionally is called populist parties on the very right, which I personally call, but that's another talk, social nationalists. So what are we going to do with all of this now? First, I would like to say that when we are thinking about constitution, and de facto we are having a constitution in the European Union, which is basically our treaties, we are normally thinking of written texts. But in German, we have nice words to explain that it's not just the written text. We have two. One is called Verfassungswirklichkeit, so the constitutional reality, and the other word is called Verfasstheit, which also goes beyond the written text. So basically, a constitution is not just the written text, it's also the constitutional practice, and it's also the judgment of a constitutional court or Supreme Court. That means we have here the acknowledgement that the constitutional reality is permanently changing. And sometimes, and again I have to address to Sergio, we have a situation where the texts are more than 200 years old, and at the beginning this was very much dominated by Congress, and it was meant for the president to be as weak as possible because they didn't want the Georgians back. But then because of necessity and without major change in the text, you arrive in the 20th century at the imperial presidency leader of the Western world. So I'm saying this to say we have seen a lot of movement since 2009 in constitutional reality, how the European Council is developing, how the Parliament is developing, maybe a little bit less on how the Council is developing. But all of this in itself first is absolutely normal. So, to conclude, I would like to say the following. First, there are many individual phenomena I've tried to describe. So, is there a bigger story there? How can we make sense of it? How does it all fit together? What keeps everything together? I would argue that the big change that step by step materialized more and more after 2009, so after the coming into force of the Lisbon Treaty, is the emergence of the European Council as the collective presidency of the European Union. A collective presidency somewhere between the German and the French model. The German president is invited to give speeches, which should be inspiring. The French president thinks he can decide basically everything. And then people on the road and demonstrating in the cities with violence tell him that this is not the case. So this collective presidency somehow fills in the last available spot in the constitutional setup that was still available. You have the legislative function divided between the Chamber of the Citizens and the Chamber of the States. You have the Commission as a kind of executive, but we don't have a monarch, we didn't have an elected president, so they fill in the last available spot, which is the collective presidency of the Union. Does this make sense? I think we have seen that this can be functional because it has provided us with the possibility to activate sufficient legitimacy in crisis situations. That means the European Council is able to elevate issues from the national level to the European level more or less ad hoc. That's what I call the elevator function of the European Council. Somebody once in a debate told me, okay, you want to make them lift boys. No, not really. But they have a function which is to elevate in times of need and sometimes under enormous time pressure an issue from just national to European decision making. We also have to acknowledge that they did speed up in crisis response. So crisis response, financial crisis, years maybe. COVID, 6 weeks. Ukraine, okay, thanks also to the Commission, 2 days. So somehow we are getting a bit better. And also, they are integrating national leaders, nolens volens, so whether they want or not, into the European machine. By not only meeting twice a year, 4 times a year, but more or less monthly, which means they have to spend the week before in preparing and the week afterwards. You see? They are co-opted into the system, and it's very difficult to completely escape and to say, I have nothing to do with this. What kind of decisions are they? I would argue that we are transitioning from legislative machine to complementary executive capacity. So where we have always been extremely good was in legislation. 1,000 amendments, no problem. 2,000 amendments, we can deal with it. 3,000 amendments in agriculture, maybe we send it back to committee. But there we have been very good. But executive capacity, where you basically speak about the functions of the state, member states were not really ready to give to us, except in extreme crisis situations. So we got out of the financial crisis banking supervision, but also huge joint pots of money to deal with the situation. We got out of the migration crisis a European Coast and Border Guard. We got out of COVID joint procurement procedures, which now might be applied as well, or are applied as well on energy. And we are moving much further than we thought originally possible in the area of defense now with Ukraine. So the European Council moved from competence catalog to can-do approach. What is the weakness of the European Council? The weakness of the European Council is that they have no collective content capacity. They all have their ministries who think for their individual states. But in the Council Secretariat, they didn't build up a joint content capacity which is sufficient to deal content-wise in crisis, which means they always have to address to the European Commission. The European Commission has to come up with a solution, and better quickly, and you know, they have 35,000 staff, and hopefully some have a good idea. So only the European Commission has that capacity, and for really complex issues, therefore the Commission is put into the position of monopolist. They're the only ones who can bail them out or bail us out together. And that in turn favors the process of prime ministerialization of the Commission President. She's in control, she's the interlocutor, she directs and reduces the function of the college. So my last remark is, how can we then strengthen parliaments? So national parliaments in fusion of power systems have difficulty to control executives. As I said already, best practice is Finnish, and we need gold standards for control by national parliaments. We need to transform ad hoc intergovernmental arrangements into the treaties. We need to address health and defense. And if you can pardon me, it is important, if we are thinking of balance of power between institutions, to re-establish the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. I was accused in 2014 to have been the devious mind behind the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. I had half a page in the Financial Times, never before, never after. I was not the only devious mind. But it's very important to balance out between institutions. If you have the impression the European Council is taking too much weight without proper control, then balance it out with the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. It provides additional legitimacy, readability of the system, and better institutional governance. The European Council is not too weak and doesn't need your protection. Because I know this argument from the time. So, what is the precondition for all of this? We need to understand the European Union is a two-chamber system. We have two equal sources of legitimacy. We need two qualified majorities for a Spitzenkandidat, and therefore the candidates, therefore the candidate selection needs to take this regularly into account. It did it in 2014, not in 2019. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and inspiring speech. And now I would like to open the panel discussion on prospects of European democracy. Let me briefly introduce our distinguished guest panelists. So, Professor Brigid Laffan, Emeritus Professor at the European University Institute. Her prime academic interest covers EU governance and Europeanization, Brexit and public finances. Our second panelist is Albena Azmanova. She's Professor of Political and Social Science at the University of Kent. And she has written extensively on populism, the rise of new ideologies, the crisis of democracy, rule of law, and democratic transitions. And the third panelist, Adam Jasser, is deputy editor of Visegrad, working at Visegrad Insight and Publica Nowa, and specializing in Central Eastern Europe, I guess. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation to take part in this panel. And before I let you speak on from your field of expertise, I would like to ask you for like a few minutes kind of comments, reactions to what was said in our introductory speech. So, Brigid? Yes, please.
Can I begin by thanking Klaus very much for the breadth of his intervention. And I think he started out by saying, what's the appropriate model of organization? And that reminds me of, there was a declaration appended to the signing of the Paris Treaty in '51, where the heads of the signatories there actually used the word organized Europe. So we're dealing with an organized Europe. And for Klaus, the model or the appropriate form is federal. And adopting that lens, then one automatically, it leads one in the direction of the malfunctions. In other words, if that's the perception, but it could be argued, firstly, that there's a baked-in duality in the EU, that it's two kinds of union. It's a union of states and a union of peoples, and that there's a tension there between how you organize the union of peoples and how you organize the union of states. And if you, instead of using the word federal, use the word confederal, then many of the malfunctions fall away, because the states, the importance of the states in the EU are acknowledged. So I think we need to, depending on the lens, it leads one to certain conclusions about this organized Europe. And in my view, the union of states and union of peoples must be held in somewhat in balance. And if you drive one at the expense of the other, then, and of course the union of states, the confederal side of the EU, using that language is stronger. And that's because union of peoples had to be built. It was much easier to build a union of states because you had executives, parliaments, state institutions. But peoples implies politics and identity. And so I think what I would also say is that when we think about organized Europe, we also need not just to think about the institutions and assume that if you change the institutions, you automatically change politics. And we actually need to think more about the organization of politics in Europe. And the states remain the primary containers of legitimate politics in Europe. That's not to say, and I don't for 1 minute would not argue that European Parliament elections aren't important, that layer isn't important. But I think we also can't have the EU without the states. So that's so. Firstly, the confederal. Secondly, the challenge of politics of having political parties are weak at European level, but also the underlying cleavage structures are very different. So I think that all matters. But there is an incipient transnational people's Europe emerging, and it's been growing and it's been strengthening. That transnational element of European politics has been growing and strengthening for I would say almost from the 80s onwards. And then finally, let me say on the Spitzenkandidaten, so if I had a preference for a transformative political event in Europe, it would be that we would directly elect the Commission President, and that it would happen at the same time as the Parliament elections, but that it would not come through the parliamentary system to hold the Union of States and Unions of People in balance. But I also think that's an experiment, and one can't assume what the consequences are, the unintended consequences are, or whatever. So I think that we should be wary of thinking that there are easy institutional fixes to the challenges and problems of politics in Europe today.
Thank you. Albena, please.
Yes, thank you. Now, in this lecture you gave us, an image emerged of the European bodies, decisional bodies, of developing more decisional power, right? What you described as legislative, the Council legislates, then the European Commission initiates legislation, the Parliament legislates. So there is a lot of accrued decisional power. But this seems not to be matched with enough executive power in the sense of implementation. So we have this gap between the capacity of forward-looking action, indeed, in terms of decisions, as we see the European Green Deal, but then very little delivery, or very difficult delivery on that. Actually, this is something that has been discussed a little bit here. So it seems to me that we need to address this. It emerges from your talk. Now, another point, actually, Jon Erik has been working on this discrepancy, right, between implementation and promise. But I see it as a discrepancy between decisional capacity. That's absolutely fantastic, and incapacity to deliver. So the second point, you mentioned the EU commitment to growing the cake together and then hitting the difficult point of distributing the cake. I think the issue is different. It is how we grow the cake. Because it seems to me that since the turn of the century, when the EU and member states committed to the imperative of maintaining competitiveness in the globally integrated market, that imperative of competitiveness entailed a lot of labor market liberalization, deregulation, destabilization of livelihoods. And this is something that is brewing, that is fueling populism or national or social nationalism, as you put it. So we need to be careful not only about how we grow and distribute about growing, but how exactly, what kind of policies are used in growing that cake. And then linked to that, to your point about mechanisms of crisis management that we have developed recently. It seems to me that we also need to screen how our institutions actually integrate risk. Let me clarify that with one very striking example. You know about the Innovative Medicine Initiative of the European Commission? It is a private-public entity, so European Commission and Big Pharma, together committed to developing cutting-edge programs for the sake of public health. So in 2018, the European Commission said there is a danger of coronavirus infection. We don't know what type, but there is a danger. So let's develop vaccines, 2018. And then, of course, Big Pharma said, no thanks, it's not competitive, it's not, we cannot expect profit from that. So that integration of a free market or of the logic, the economic logic of competitiveness into decision-making about public services, we need to screen and cleanse that in the Commission structures, in the EU structures, I propose. So this is from me for now.
Mm-hmm. And Adam?
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk, thank you. I'm a little intimidated because, you know, speaking before such a distinguished group of academics who study democracy and basically breathe democracy, I have a very sort of practical view of all of this. So you know, you're describing trends and institutional setups. So maybe I'll drawing on my experience as a journalist who watched the democratic transition in Central Europe and in some Western countries as well, the election process and covering the EU institutions from a practical point of view. What I would like to say, and also having some policy experience sitting on the other side, namely in government, I think to me, the bottom line is that there are these trends, there are these institutional challenges, but when it comes to the really biggest challenges for Europe, for democracy, it's actually what Harold Macmillan once described as events, dear boy, events. And I think, you know, in the past 30 years, we've had a number of really transformative events. So if you start with the fall of the Berlin Wall, this was a triumph of democracy in many ways, right? And in a sense, for a second it seemed that the end of history really had come, and that basically politics didn't matter anymore that much, and democracy became a bit of a soap opera, where politicians were having discussions on a number of issues which did not necessarily resonate very well with the public. And there was something I would describe as a technocratic capture of the democratic process. So basically, politicians outsourced management to technocrats. And this was also indirectly the result of the end of the Cold War. And it was also an indirect or maybe direct result of the fact that mainstream parties converged on the center. You know, it was very hard to distinguish between social democrats and Christian Democrats, for that matter, for a substantial part of the 90s and even early 2000s. You even had coalitions of these two mainstream political parties because the policies converged so much. And then, of course, this inevitably led to another transformative event, which was the big crisis, when it turned out that this technocratic takeover basically failed, and that politics, it was politics stupid, not economics stupid, as Clinton famously remarked, and the financialization of our economies, the oversized influence of the financial sector on policies, independent institutions which were essential to the democratic order, they became almost autonomous, and despite their professionalism and sort of apolitical character, they basically failed to predict the crisis. And then paradoxically, it was the same institutions that saved democracy, because if you remember the peak of the financial crisis and the moment when the Eurozone looked on the brink of collapse, it was the unelected president of the European Central Bank who actually saved the euro. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think that the crisis, and I was in government during the crisis, it seemed to me that a lot of the backlash that we observed in terms of how democracies function and in terms of the sort of popular revolt against the democratic tenets of government stemmed from the crisis and from the inability of the political system to really cope with these big challenges. So if you look at phenomena such as the rise of the alt-right in the United States, of Brexit, Donald Trump, the sort of autocratic tendencies, I still see this as a backlash to this transformative event of the big crisis, which, you know, as soon as it was more or less over, the pandemic happened, and now we have another transformative event, which is the war in Ukraine. And what really strikes me is, yesterday I was fascinated by this quantitative analysis, which showed that there is a 70% more or less pragmatic majority in most of our countries, and I think that's a very positive phenomenon, if you will, because now this war in Ukraine has forced everyone to reevaluate democracy and the values that underpin it. I mean, the distinction between tyranny and democracy became a little clearer. Maybe during the crisis it got a little confused, and maybe there was some tendency to perceive autocratic model of governance and sort of rebellion against the elites and what have you as a way forward. Suddenly a war and people prepared to die for democracy and for rule of law, that makes people think. And if you look at opinion polls and surveys of public opinion in Western countries, It's surprisingly strong. The resilience of support for Ukraine is really surprising. You know, a lot of pundits were arguing that this is going to crumble as the war drags on. Societies in the Western world are going to gradually push for peace, and that the governments will be under pressure. I think the contrary is happening. Many societies are becoming more resilient, and politicians follow. If you see, you know, the change from a year ago when Zelensky was making his appeals and traveling or meeting officials, you know, politicians were sort of hesitating, you know, one step forward, two steps back. Today, they all rush to him and want to embrace him because obviously it works on their own electorates. So, to me, this is, you know, this war is a transformative event, and the institutional and other changes will follow.
Adam,
and this is beautiful from a democratic point of view, because it shows that it really is coming from the bottom, which is a good conclusion. And just one last sentence. I think we have to get used to the idea that more and more the European discussion about the setup, the institutions, the democratic governance will be influenced by external pressures. I mean, you know, we can have a lot of internal discussions about lots of things, but migration, China, technology, America, increasingly going its own way, whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, doesn't matter. America will be pursuing its own interests in Asia and decoupling from Europe. So there will be a lot of external pressures, and I think they will have a decisive influence on how the European institutions and the whole European project will evolve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Klaus, before I let you speak on this, I would like to still ask the panelists to actually address a bit more from their field of expertise to tell us a bit about the prospect for democracy in relation to the three interrelated dimensions: institutions, rule of law, mobilization movements, the lived experience of the active European citizens. And I know that there was this idea that we will be talking about this each dimension separately, but maybe for the sake of also time, I would like each of you to maybe address these three dimensions. What do you think? What are the main challenges, strengths, key challenges for the prospects of European democracy in relation to these three dimensions? So, Brigid, if we can start with you. About 10 minutes.
Thank you. So firstly, can I reiterate a point I've already made, and that is that we shouldn't think of democracy in institutional terms only, that we've got to also think about the underlying politics and how politics works in Europe. Secondly, I would say, when it comes to European democracy, that we cannot and should not think of European democracy as only EU level, because the EU is nothing without its member states. So it matters the quality of democracy in the member states as well. On the one point on institutions that I didn't make, and I will make this, is that I actually don't see the European Council as a major problem in the structure of the EU. Why? Because I think it brings a necessary salience of the political office holders with most authority, political authority, and most legitimacy, who have won elections or head their parliaments and can lose at the next election. And I think that the challenges that the EU faced, in my view, the European Council has been an agenda setter almost from the 70s onwards in the EU. It's just, its visibility and saliency increased because of the demands of the crises post-Lisbon. And also, politics needs political theatre. And the European Council brings political theatre. You get the doorstops, you get it covered by the media. There's always a very big media core for the European Council. I think there was a loss in having all European Council meetings in Brussels, when it went round national capitals in the presidencies, it meant that each member state was getting an up-close view of the political theatre, but I fully accept that that was not tenable in a large EU. We didn't talk at all this morning about the permanent president of the European Council, and I think that office has also been very important in the last period. And I'm not going into the strengths and weaknesses of the various office holders, but what it has done is it's given a permanent presence in Brussels to someone whose job it is to organise the European Council and its coherence. And so I think that's again a very important development, and one that should be welcomed. And there are strengths and weaknesses of the various office holders. So thinking long term about the institutional setup, I think the European Parliament has probably maxed out on its powers. It is a co-legislator. The one big shift in the EU would be if it actually developed tax-raising powers, and that would strengthen the role of the Parliament. But once the Parliament is on the output side of the legislative side and is not responsible other than via the budget but we know public finance the EU budget is small in relative terms. Now, one has to ask, is it likely that public finance will play a larger role in the dynamic of European integration in future? And I think what we've already seen is that in response to these various crises, there has had to public finance has played an important role, the RRF, which is not a Hamiltonian moment, but it was a significant breach in a taboo. So I would watch carefully what happens public finance and European integration. I think you will get off-treaty or extra-treaty financial engineering. You will get within-treaty developments, but you'll also get that area that, again, we should keep an eye on is collective procurement. In other words, using the collective power of the public finances of the member states in relation to vaccines vis-a-vis pharma, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that I would carefully watch what happens in the public finance basket and whether or not law will continue to be the main source of public power in the EU. But I think the trends, if we think how Europe will deal with the dual transformation, digital and climate, then I think one is likely to see developments on the public finance side, which, in my view, would take the European Parliament beyond the dominance of legislation. And obviously, if you tax, then representation matters. So that's where I think I would see. I don't see a major reorganization of the fundamental institutions of the EU. I think if there were a new treaty, you would have some tinkering, but I don't think that you would see major shifts. And of course, also, what is the relationship between the primary, the so-called constitution and the day-to-day? And in the EU, there has to be, in order for the EU to function, there has to be a sufficient level of convergence on the overarching framework for the system to work. But then it can't become a straitjacket, and is not a straitjacket. You also have to have the working out of normal politics, the day-to-day policy making. And that's likely to continue. On the rule of law, I think Hungary in particular would not be admitted as a member state today with the state capture that has occurred there. I think it's right and proper that the EU uses all of the instruments that it has, both financial and legal, to address it. But, and this is a conversation I had at dinner last night with Klaus, to what extent is the rule of law crisis impacting on the functioning of the EU? To what extent? So that's one question. And the second is, if it's episodic, then it's far less problematic than if it's a permanent problem. So again, that depends on how much, what prospect there is for government turnover particularly in my view in Hungary, but there are other countries as well. And then I think the third was that development of the associative.
It was the citizens level, so it was the mobilization of the citizens movement.
Yeah. So I think that the EU has a developed associative element now. Brussels is not unlike Washington when it comes to NGOs. I think the big issue is what one might call not the organized public, because they're in Brussels, but the disorganized public. And one has to ask how you tap into, more generally, into the attitudes and views and preferences of citizens. But I think it's also fair to say that most European citizens are not particularly interested in the EU. They want the EU to function. They probably want a better EU. They may not want more EU, but they want a better EU if they're minded at all to think about it. So again, there are no. So I think one of the benefits of Brexit has been that it has reminded all Europeans of the cost of untying the ties that bind, the cost of deciding that you want to take back control and not live with a world involving strong ties, mobility with other member states. And I think that's been very useful. I think I agree with you on the war in Ukraine. That's another important reminder to us all. And the pandemic had the advantage of reminding us that experts also matter. So I think that it's interesting that the last number of crises, basically Brexit on, have probably been better crises for the EU than the Eurozone. The EU handled the Eurozone crisis extremely badly at a very high social, political and economic cost. It could have been handled much more cheaply, cost less money, breaking less eggs in social, political and economic terms. But I think it's also interesting that it's the 3 programme countries are leading Europe at the moment in growth and have turned the corner economically. So we would need to look at this again in about 5 or 6 years' time.
Albena, if I could ask
Yes.
you for your opinion now.
So I want to note that rule of law backsliding has affected not only the infamous Eastern Europe, but the mature democracies as well. Now, the European Commission assumed graciously the role of an ultimate guardian, when usually that guardianship is divided between the European Court of Justice, the Parliament and the Commission. But in year 2000, it started this screening, rule of law reporting on each member state. And by doing that, it assumed a very important role of oversight. Now, as I have claimed in a report I actually conducted for the European Parliament's Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, the title says it all. The title is Binding the Guardian on the European Commission's Failure to Safeguard the Rule of Law. I screen there the way the European Commission reports on France, Spain and Bulgaria, and they're all failure cases. So this is very alarming. If you assume the role of ultimate guardian, how do we bind that guardian? So let's think about, you know, mechanisms of making the European institutions do properly this safeguarding role. And then I come to the next point, though. It's in my research, I claim that the reasons for the rule of law backsliding are not simply institutional. They have much to do with socioeconomic context, with the socioeconomic dynamics of recent years, and these in turn have to do with EU and member state policies of economic liberalization in the context of globally integrated markets. So the pressures of remaining competitive, I already mentioned that, has led our, you know, decisional bodies at all levels of authority to do very naughty things, like a destabilization of employment, reducing unemployment insurance. Some of the most precarious workers now are the self-employed. But also, as I explained in my last book, Capitalism on Edge, precarity or this kind of disempowerment of citizens and of public bodies because of instability of livelihoods is a pandemic. It affects, I mean, even the well-employed on secure contracts. Now, why? Because there has been a steady process of putting responsibilities on citizens and on lower levels of governance and assuming power on top. So this disalignment between the responsibilities. We are responsible for getting employed, for getting the proper education, for finding a job, for remaining healthy, safeguarding the environment. So we're more and more put the pressures on citizens and with less and less capacity to deliver. So this incapacity to cope is experienced on all levels, across class, education, gender. I believe this is really the harm afflicting the 99%. So the issue is what kind of policies can counter that, and the EU has much to do because it was actually done a lot to generate that massive precarity. This is what I would like to. So as to citizens, now, the citizens should demand economic stability. Now why? Why I want to stress stability so much rather than, fighting inequality, for instance. Now, we have to reconcile the agenda of environmental justice with social justice. But we cannot do that by growing the pie more and redistributing because we're, destroying the environment. You need to give something to people. Living standards would be hit, but you need to give something back to people. So you need to swap affluence with economic stability. Then you might have the Democrats do the right thing, vote for, support these green policies. So citizens should demand from their elites economic stability. The second, we should think of more creative mechanisms of democratic accountability in order to tie the guardians. Now, I think this accrued decisional power is great. We need this accrued decisional power in times of crisis, and we live in times of crisis. But these bodies need to be more accountable, not so much responsive to citizens, because citizens' concerns are in the present, not in the future. People would always, when asked, worry more about the end of the month than the end of the world. But so, what kind of accountability mechanisms can allow our decision makers to look forward and still make them tied to the public good? Calypso Nicolaides has been writing about the democratic panopticon. So some sort of transparency mechanisms in which our leaders can feel all the time watched, you know, rather than all the time being called into account, but that they know that it can be called into account all the time. So I would invite thinking along those lines on new mechanisms of accountability, because clearly electoral accountability doesn't cut it anymore. Yeah.
Adam?
Thank you. I spoke at length before, so now I will just limit my remarks to one thing, that, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, and I hate looking into the crystal ball, even if I had it. But I'm worried about this East-West divergence at the moment on the rule of law, and I would agree with you that we don't know yet if it's episodic or if it's something that will continue to influence things. But life hates vacuum, and if this rule of law backsliding and autocratic tendencies take deeper root and become a permanent feature, then I can hardly imagine that this is sustainable. So, and now I'm going to look into the crystal ball after all, and I will say that to me it's inevitable that that parts of Western Europe will just find an alternative solution, you know, and the Eurozone is already something which some of the countries with problems with rule of law are actually not part of. So that provides an easy avenue for everyone to say, okay, well, you know, okay, we can have Europe of different speeds and different levels of integration. The patience is, in my view, running out, and of course the fate of Ukraine will influence that. And so far, we haven't seen a clear champion of Ukraine's membership, but if Germany moves, and I will remind everyone that the first wave of enlargement was a no theme until Germany made a firm commitment that yes, we are going to take in new members from Central and Eastern Europe. So if Germany offers this kind of leadership on Ukraine, things will start happening, because this will enforce a certain dynamic, it will enforce the discussion about the majority voting, and suddenly these majorities, which today are unthinkable or difficult to construct, they will appear. So politics again will trump things. And a lot depends on Germany, to be. The court is in your ball now, Klaus. But there's no way around this. Germany plays a central role in all of this, and if Germany doesn't provide leadership one way or the other, things will just carry on. You know, I believe, you know, it's not necessary for institutional change. We can carry on for a long period with what we've got. But the Ukraine question is going to force somebody's hand sooner or later, because at the end of this game, there is also either it's binary. It's either yes to Ukraine's membership, or at the end of the day, it's no. And someone will have to make that decision. And over to you, Berlin.
Yes, thank you. So Klaus, I would like to ask you now to comment to your speech, but also to the following, you know, views on the prospects for democracy, European democracy.
Yeah, maybe let me say first that I'm not Berlin, because I'm Westphalian and we were occupied by the Prussians, you know. The good thing they left behind were their horses. We are now very famous for horses, but in fact they were the horses of the Prussian occupants, you know. So that's how we got our horses. A couple of remarks, maybe starting backwards. I absolutely believe that further enlargement to Ukraine, rule of law, and a kind of big deal on the outstanding issues, qualified majority, and so on, they are absolutely linked. Poland and Hungary cannot hope that the European Union is enlarging to Ukraine if the issues of rule of law are not settled. So there's a decision to be taken there. You can't have it both. It's the one or the other. And equally, I believe that until that moment there can be small, you know, sectorial changes to the treaties, maybe kind of cleaning up operation from intergovernmental to integrated where it's possible, or a little bit on defense, a little bit on health, but the big issues I think will have to be settled for the same reasons in the context of enlargement. Because Poland and others otherwise will simply block it. So there is a decision to be taken. You want a bigger European Union. Then you also need to accept that decision making then still has to function. And I found your idea very interesting, that with the Eurozone there is an alternative setup in principle, waiting. I'm in favor of the big union, 27. I'm in favor of Ukraine. But let's say there are also limits to what the other countries will be ready to tolerate. And a couple of remarks from my side on the comments made. Of course, content. You know, it's not all about institutions. I was just asked to speak about institutions. That's why I spoke about institutions. Events is also, as that's the point you made, is absolutely crucial. So Brigid was saying, yeah, if we are not saying federal, if we just say confederal, we have no problems anymore. But do we want to see no problems? That's my question, you see? Because if we don't see problems anymore, we don't know where to go. We don't know what to do. And when I say federal, I'm not speaking about federation. I'm just speaking about the way things are organized in division of labor. I'm not speaking of the state. I'm not speaking about European Federation. I'm speaking about way things are organized horizontally and vertically. And personally, I prefer to see problems because then they can be addressed. On identity, yes, there's some. It might also be growing. It also depends on the external threat. We know that identity is growing with external threat. But we also know that identities are social artifacts. We know that the nation state is relatively young. In Germany, we owe it to Napoleon. Napoleon visited us so intensively and so regularly that we came to the conclusion we needed a German nation state, because up to then Germany was the territory foreign armies were transferring through. And then a lot of investments were made in national history museums and so on. So identities are social artifacts. The nation state was not always. It's a relatively recent invention. And it's not necessarily the end of history. I would argue that the multitude of nation states you're having now are only possible because you have the European Union. In a very direct sense, the further we go to the east, the Baltic country, I mean, how was it before? If the alternative is empire or union of citizens and states, we know how our European map looked like in the times of empire. The Ottoman Empire, the French, the British, the Germans also tried very belatedly to create one, which was not a very good experience. The Austrian Habsburg Empire. Small states and communities had no chance to exist. Slovenia never existed outside the conditions of, let's say, European Union. So I would say the European Union is the precondition for the existence of so many independent nation states. So that belongs together. And for those which are not directly threatened by their bigger neighbors like Russia, at least it fulfills functions a nation state on its own could no longer fulfill. So can identity grow? Historically, we know identity can grow. But the objective situation needs to be there, and also we need to invest. And that's, for example, why one of the reasons why the European Parliament does such a strange thing as creating a House of European History, where for the first time history can be reconstructed also from a European perspective, besides a national perspective or regional perspective. And maybe one final remark here. I think technology is a game changer. We can see this in European elections. Language technology is a game changer. Suddenly we always assume people couldn't communicate. Yeah, but with translation software, interpretation software, suddenly people speak directly. We thought this was an objective, eternal limit to integration and joint identity, and it has stopped to be one. And then my last remark, because of course I have to say something. Brigid has said the EP probably has maxed out. I would say never underestimate us. Why? Why? Because of the different culture of the institutions. The culture, you know, if you have been the monopolist originally, you're very tempted to adopt a culture of status quo because you like the status quo. Status quo is good for you. That's the culture of the council. If you are the underdog and you have nothing, you don't like the status quo, you know. You have to be a bit anarchist. Those who don't like anarchy, I could say the market functions also with anarchical principles. So you have to be innovative. You always have to go a bit across the line. And that's the culture in Parliament. So just saying, to underline this a bit, what have we done recently? 2019 with the incoming Commission President, we said, look, if you are representing institutional setback, we are not going to vote for you. So you have to compensate for the fact that you are not a Spitzenkandidat, and we make you a good offer. The good offer is, if Parliament passes a legislative own initiative report with qualified majority, you make a commitment that you submit this as legislation. That's what she did. That was the precondition of her election. And up to now, the Commission is keeping its promise. So I would just like to say, never underestimate Parliament, because we have a culture which is creative, because for 70 years we have been the underdog and we had no alternative possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to react to that, any of the panelists?
So can I just say, firstly, I would not want what I said to be interpreted that I don't think there are issues and challenges and problems of government in the EU, but rather that depending on the lens with which you view the system, it leads you to different analysis and different conclusions. So that's the only point I'm making, that we need to, there's a prior. And then secondly, on under or overestimating the Parliament, not only would I not underestimate, it is a power-seeking institution for all of the reasons that you mentioned. But if I look at the history of the Parliament from the 1970s onwards, it has accrued extensive powers and significant powers, and I think that's a good thing. I'm not arguing, but I also think the Parliament needs to be careful not to overplay its hand and overplay its legitimacy. And I think the Parliament also needs to be attentive to what happens in the House, to the standards, norms, and in my view in the European Parliament, there are too many friends of, you know, small informal groups, etc., etc. So I think that the Parliament has to be held to the same standards of propriety as one would expect from any institution. So that's the only point I make, that I wouldn't either reify the Parliament or say that it has, when I say maxed out on powers, I think it's done pretty well on legislation. And I'm not arguing against that, but I think it's done pretty well.
Anyone else would like to react?
I just want to correct maybe something that we mentioned earlier about the East-West divide on the rule of law. It is very dangerous to think like that, because unless the European Commission addresses and the court address very seriously, very rigidly the rule of law violations in the West, then those institutions would not have the authority to tell the East how to straighten its kitchen. So that's just the correction I wanted.
Okay, now I have to. Well, I didn't really mean that this divide is in terms of just irregularities or rule of law problems in the East or the media freedom or whatever. But scale matters. And there is a critical point beyond which it's very difficult to even react to it. If you look at Turkey, you know, it took Erdogan, what, 15 years to basically, you know, it's still an elective democracy, but is it a level playing field? Is it, I mean, the institutional capture has gone so far that it becomes impossible, as we saw recently, to change that. And I think Hungary is probably somewhere there already. And we will see in October if Poland is going in the same direction. And as a matter of fact, I'm not entirely sure that the Commission should commit so much effort to reverse that, because if it's coming from the will of the people, then, you know, to me the Commission is on shaky ground. If these societies want to drift away, they should be allowed to. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, exit is possible.
Okay then, so with this voice, I would like to open the discussion because I can see that people in the room are very eager to ask questions. So please,
Thank you very much, Klaus, and thank you to the panel. So many questions to raise, so I'll have to be very, very brief. I was fascinated by your concept, Klaus, of the weakest link, and I was just wondering where you were referring to the fact that the UK, while in many ways quite a strong link within the European Union, was so uncommitted to the idea of ever closer union, but there were big divisions within the UK. Clearly you don't think the weakest link is the weakest economically, but is it, in fact, what we've just been discussing, the countries which are backsliding from European values? Are they the real weakest link, and what do we do about them? But two questions, and I'll be short. The first one is the future role of the European Parliament. The dialogue a little bit between you and Brigid Laffan. The European Parliament has clearly gained a huge amount of powers, as we've said, but now it's probably the scope for further increase in formal power is probably relatively limited. Maybe what Brigid was saying about capacity over raising the budget, maybe. I think confirmation hearings of European Court of Justice probably unlikely, but I'd like to know what you think about that. But much more importantly, the European Parliament has been challenged by these crises from the financial crisis onwards. It's got away from the co-decision single market stuff to areas where the European Parliament has a more difficult position. How should it handle that? And finally, on this point, how does it handle the very important question of implementation of powers? Because I think it's quite difficult, having worked myself with so many MEPs, working on new institutional ideas is a more attractive job than working on nitty-gritty implementation of whether policies are actually working. My final question, I promise this will be short, Chair, is on Spitzenkandidat, which succeeded, in inverted commas, in 2014, clearly failed in 2019, and it's going to be critical what happens to it next time round. It seemed to me that it should have been linked to the question of a transnational list, but that now seems to have faded away. So what do you think will happen in 2024? And will a renomination of Ursula von der Leyen by the EPP and then her re-election be counted as a triumph or a failure of Spitzenkandidaten? Thank you.
Thank you. I suggest that we collect a few questions, yes? So there are two, before I let you speak, there was Jon Erik here as well, so please, go
Klaus,
ahead.
thank you very much for the very interesting panel. I want to draw you a little bit back to the theme of the overall initiative, namely differentiation. I wonder, Brigid mentioned, you know, the depending on the lens you put in front of you, you see different parts of the system. I wonder, when you were describing the European institutions, the way they work, the links to democracy, whether they are in fact a system or not a conglomeration of systems that coexist with each other and which are more or less linked. I think of my university, it constitutes of 18 faculties. We're all part of the university, but the way in which my own faculty runs is very little impacted by what happens in any of the other faculties. And I presume the same applies for many of the European institutions and for the way in which the system or the different parts link together. The fact that the institutions derive their authority from one common document or a set of documents does not mean that they are very strongly interlinked. Many of them derive even their legal authority from a plurality of different legal sources, and the question of where they get their resources from, their money from, their organizational capacity from, their personnel from, their trust from, their legitimacy from, is also very differentiated. So moving back to the theme of this conference and of this event, is there not a danger that one systematically over-stresses the linkages, and everything is always connected to everything else, whereas in fact a lot of the action capacity of the European Union lies precisely in the fact that many things are very weakly interlinked, if at all. And we see this, I think, also very well if you look at the different enlargement rounds. You know, those amongst us who are a bit older, it couldn't work with 25 members, it couldn't work with 27, it couldn't work when Austria first had an extreme right-wing party in the government, it can't work when Meloni comes to power in Italy, and yet somehow it works. All this seems to suggest that the functional linkages are maybe much weaker than many on the panel seem to assume.
Thank you. So Jon Erik and then Dirk, and then I give back the voice to the panel. No, but Jon Erik goes first, then Dirk, and then Sergio. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Let me start with a comment on rule of law backsliding. If we see the European Union as a collective of democratic states, constitutional democracies, and that the member states still are the primary upholders of the European Constitution. This is not denying that the European Union also has a material constitution, but if you say that the member states are still the main upholders of the democratic quality of constitutional democracy in Europe, then it is the member states' responsibility to prevent rule of law backsliding. This is not something that it should be offloading to the European institutions, which they themselves have denied the democratic legitimacy to operate as a guardian of these principles. Therefore, the member states are compelled to take action by this the very principle that they themselves are endorsing and implanting on the European Union. So it's a logical fallacy in actually simply offloading this to the European Union. In fact, I think this is a normative shirking of responsibility on the basis of the democratic nation states. So they are themselves undermining the collective dignity of democracy in Europe by not acting adequately on this, okay? Federalism, in my view, is the only guarantee for states' rights. And I think that the European Council is a very interesting example of this, because what we see with the European Council is that in the current situation, it is both having a treaty-making role, that is, it has a fundamental role in shaping the constitution of Europe. Secondly, it is actually both operating as a federal balancer between the community system and the union system, and it is at the same time undertaking more and more of the balancing. And this is an overload function. Normally, you think about making constitutions in separate bodies, and that's set that aside. In the European Union situation, the European Council is actually undertaking an ongoing balancing of issues, whilst also trying to, or not trying to, set the terms of the balance. And the fact that the European Council itself has denied the specific character of the European Union, as Brigid was saying, that it depends on where you stand, what type of perspectives or normative standards you put down. The fact that they have systematically denied to declare what kind of political system this is a shirking of responsibility. This is a democratic constitutional deficit. So themselves also are responsible for this. The final thing is, I just want you to reflect on what capacity, increased capacity for the European Union and the Parliament would mean for unlocking issues, because there's a lot of talk about treaty changes. I think that the moment the European Union gets a significant amount of capacity, the game changes. Thanks.
Thank you. So Dirk and Sergio.
Dirk Leuven, University of Constance. My question goes to Klaus Welle. So I'm a big fan of Charles Plot's fundamental equation of politics, which says institutions times preferences equals outcomes. And you were strongly elaborating on the institutional part, and the preference part came a bit short, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the role of parties in the entire system, which role parties play. So when we think of the British system and Walter Bagehot, so the efficient secret, so the cabinet system, the role of parties, so how does that come into your model of the EU? And second short question, or I don't know whether it's short, depends on your answer. When we met last year at the Jean Monnet House out of Paris, that was shortly before the conference on the future of Europe ended, and the big issue we were a little bit discussing was this issue about the agenda setting power of the EP, and you have not really, or maybe I was too tired this morning, but I didn't hear you elaborate on that one, which I would think is a huge, a tremendous development for the EP if it could gain it. So have you become more skeptical that this will actually be happening? We were all kind of optimistic, or falling okay, or following up on what Klaus Goetz earlier said, is it really because of the tremendous resource endowment that would be linked to this institutional change? Because you get it right, but you got to fill it with content and with staff, with people preparing legislation, etc. So this huge power shift, does that make you a little less optimistic that we will witness this step in shorter terms?
Thank you. And the final question for this round of questions.
Thanks very much. Of course, I cannot say that I agree with Klaus because, you know, I have some responsibility over there. But I have 3 points that I would like to raise. The first one, that I agree with Klaus on the fact that the European Union is a highly institutionalized system. All system, national political system, have different sources of legitimacy. They have interlocking relations. That seems in many ways distinct according to the logic. There is nothing new from that point of view in the European Union. Indeed, some of the system or the subsystem within the European Union are probably more institutionalized than equivalent system at the national level. I consider, for example, the EMU. The EMU is one of the most institutionalized systems comparatively with the system of economic policy that you have at the national level. So when you have an institutionalized system, first you have to consider and to analyze, to understand the logic. And second, you have to pose the question, those taking decisions in that system account to whom? How they arrive to those decisions. So this is why I agree with you that we have to make a jump, to make a jump from a processual view of the European Union to a more institutionalized view of the European Union. The second point is, Adam, you know, I found the idea that because people want democratic backsliding, from the point of view of an Italian intellectual, very puzzling. Because the European Union in the very first place, what called European Community, was exactly created by leaders of those countries who wanted to constrain democracy, not to celebrate democracy. The European Union started exactly from the disaster generated by national sovereignty between the two world wars. So it is impossible to have the European Union without constraining democracy, without creating checks and balances, ambition versus another ambition. So the fact that there are countries within the European Union say, this is what people want, is for me illogical, implausible. So if that is what people want, then there is the British way. However, this is no longer the problem, because this country, what I called yesterday sovereignist, this country criticized the European Union because constrained their own democracy, but they want to remain within the European Union. And that is the serious, I would say, the serious problem. The third question regards states. I do not agree with Brigid, of course. We discussed, it's a long period of time. She has a statist view, which is impossible to handle. The only way, as Jon Erik said, the only way to protect states, and the British never understood that, is federalism. Is the amendment number 10 of the American Constitution. Is to define exactly which are the power of the state, and all the rest, minimum regarding security, goes to the center. Where we have exactly the opposite. Because we refuse to have a federal constitution, we constitutionalize, we over-constitutionalize the single market. We transform 4 criteria of functioning of the single market in constitutional principle. This is nonsense. Because you cannot discuss regarding free circulation of people. You should discuss about free press, individual freedom. And so those are the constitutional principles that we have to be or to locate in a non-negotiable place. So I think that this idea to protect the states is basically the idea to have the European Union as an international organization, which is not what Adenauer or people like Kohl that Klaus advised thought about when they started the process of integration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I would ask now the panelists to deal with the questions.
So I will address Jon Erik's remark that it shouldn't be the job of the European Commission and the European bodies to be the ultimate safeguards of the rule of law. And indeed, that was the situation up until the enlargement to the post-communist space. That was never an issue before. So the European Commission started designing very fast the so-called rule of law toolbox, because they knew that these democracies, although new democracies, they had committed to certain values, it was not very clear what these entities would be, in fact. So I think it was some sort of a emergency mechanism, and we have that mechanism, so the issue is what to do with it now. Because even in principle, you're right, these countries do not properly commit to the rule of law. So we need an additional mechanism, unless we go in the direction of, exit, indeed.
Adam, would you like to react?
Well, it's just it's a dilemma. There are no easy answers to this, because on the one hand you have to respect the popular vote, because this is what democracy is about. But I agree with you. I mean, there are certain commitments you made. You know, there were referenda on EU membership, and there was sort of formal acceptance of the rules and principles. But we also know that democracies rely on a system of values and norms which are not codified. And it becomes a hard game when these are violated. So you can have on the surface, you have the democratic process and even the checks and balances, but then you have capture of some of these independent institutions, and you have behaviors which sort of, invalidate the whole system. So what do you do? I mean, the EU has already, I think from my perspective, the EU initially was thinking, oh, it's just a bit of a noise and this is going to pass, everyone will moderate, you know, come to their senses, so let it go. And then, you know, it reached a point where they had to react. Now they're reacting and they're not seeing much of a result. So it's just, you know, I'm not denying what you're saying. I think I'm in agreement with you. But things will come to a head at a certain point because it's unsustainable. So it's either at the end of the day compliance and sort of returning moderation and returning to the fold, or there may be exit. And Britain showed that, you know, accidents happen. Most of the politicians probably leading the Conservative Party did not expect to leave the EU, but it happened nevertheless. And even though now it's this natural experiment is proving to everyone what a disaster it was, it's still a taboo subject in Britain to reconsider, you know, that decision. You know, they're finding all sorts of different ways of addressing the issue, but without actually saying, you know, we made a mistake and we need to revisit it. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes things move and then it's very hard to stop that dynamic. And we don't know where we're heading with this, I think.
Okay, I received a couple of questions. Francis Jacobs asked, in what sense did I want to say the UK was the weakest link in terms of popular support? When you had these Eurobarometers, you know, good thing and so on. The UK was bottom of the list, if I remember correctly, and then followed by Italy. So that presents an opportunity which can be politically exploited and which was exploited by Farage, and when it led to the knock-on effect towards the Conservative Party. Secondly, where do I see the role of the EP? In fact, not everything is good. I mean, on the budget, I think we are rather moving back. We've been moving backwards, not forwards. I mean, the fact that now with Next Generation EU, you can potentially move hundreds of billions of debt in the future onto the balance sheet of the European Union without proper control of European institutions, at least of the European Parliament, I don't think it's a very good thing. And at least it's not something which is normal. When still being the Secretary General, I also had my, let's say, my administrative concepts on how to increase power of Parliament. So my idea was that you can think of democracy in time and democracy in space. So what do I mean with democracy in time? It means you have a whole life cycle of legislation, of political decision making. And if parliaments are not careful, they are just amendment machines, which means they come in at a certain moment, not before, not after. So the ambition has to be, and that was, as you still remember, probably one of our concepts, that we want to take a big important position in agenda setting, that was your question, then in consultation, then in amendment, and then in scrutiny. We want the whole life cycle for the European Parliament. So in fact, you can increase democratic power by claiming the whole life cycle for you and giving you the necessary instruments. It's not the time now to go through everything, but for example, when we come to agenda setting, not only the commitment of von der Leyen to give us this kind of qualified, but up to now maintained right of legislative initiative, but also when you have a look at when the Commission President wants to be voted into office, that's the moment of maximum weakness, because she or he needs a qualified majority. But the starting point is 25%. So she needs to convince another 25% plus one vote that they should vote her. And sometimes she needs to convince her own camp, sometimes even more. So how does she do this? I remember Prodi time was institutional requests. Nowadays, political requests. So the political groups are prepared and they say, okay, we could vote for you under conditions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We want the following 5 policy initiatives from you. So I cannot speak on everything. I had another talk, 10 ways to let's say, to shape the agenda setting function. The second thing is, The second thing is democratization in space, you know, because as a German I have to cite Einstein, you see. So it cannot only be time, it also has to be space. That means you need to build the linkage to the national level and down to the citizens, but also up. So we did strange things like establishing offices in Washington, D.C. Why? Because very often we are legislating on the same stuff at the same time, being a direct interlocutor with Congress. But we also built up our infrastructure, let's say on the national level. Cannot go more into this, but to say there are possibilities even outside the constitutional framework to increase the role of parliament and to increase it quite massively. Spitzenkandidaten. 2014 was a success. Why? Because the candidate selection was taking into account we are a system of 2 equal chambers and 2 equal legitimacies, the state and the people. And the candidate was the perfect seduction for the other ones, you know. Jean-Claude Juncker saying, I'm a Christian social democrat. He didn't say I'm a social Christian democrat. He said I'm a Christian, you know, social democrat. It doesn't get better. So you need to fulfill the criteria of both chambers and of the other side of the aisle. 2019, nothing of this was respected in the candidates chosen. So the lesson 24 is, understand we are not just a parliamentary democracy, we are a system of 2 equal chambers, of 2 sources of legitimacy, which both have to take into account. And was 2019 a complete failure? No, because 2 of them ended up as the first executive vice presidents. And since 2019, party politicization, good thing or bad thing, is everywhere. President of the European Commission, EPP, President of the European Parliament, Socialist, President of the European Council, Liberal. When they couldn't agree, they met in political groups in the European Council. All the EPP prime ministers, all the Liberal prime ministers, all the Socialist prime ministers. So it was not just a failure, and also the majority, even with the female candidate for the first time, was 8 in the European Parliament. So not an invitation to be repeated. So let's see how it goes 2024. And then I had 2 more questions, one on the role of parties. Maybe I can just say this. There is, I think, this article of Duverger from 1957, what functions political parties should fill. And many life years of students are wasted on this. By you, probably, because you are the professors. Why? If we are in a federal system based on subsidiarity, then European political parties should fulfill the functions that are not already fulfilled by national parties. If you ask them to do again what is already done by national parties, it doesn't make sense. So, European political parties in a system of subsidiarity fulfill the functions that national parties cannot fulfill. And when you look at it like this, then it starts to make sense. Because what can national parties not do? Policy coordination on the European level. Parliament, Council, European Commission. Majority building. Majorities for the European Parliament, yes, are the outcome of European elections, but in reality built through mergers and acquisitions, coalition building before. Who is doing this? European political parties. I know this because I was a Secretary General of a political party from 94 to 99 of the EPP, and that's what I did. And that was then the outcome in the 99 elections. So it's not a complete list, but don't underestimate European political parties just because you ask that they fulfill the functions that Mr. Duverger asked for political parties in 1957. Think of a system based on subsidiarity.
We still have a few minutes. I can take 1, maybe 2, 3 questions, but really brief questions. Okay, Stephen was first, Kinga, and Giuseppe.
I'll try to be quick. I'll do a quick comment and then a quick question, both of which have to do with the relationship between democracy and choice. So first, as a comment, I think it's very, very dangerous to argue that what you see in Poland or Hungary is a pitting of democracy against liberalism. Hungary is not a democratic order in very basic ways, and there's a conflation that can happen between democracy and election, but election is neither sufficient nor necessary for democracy. Athens did not have election, it was a democratic society. Hungary has elections, but the way the elections are structured is such as to actually undermine political equality between citizens. And so I think both the kind of European founding narrative that democracy needs to be pitted against liberalism and the idea that these societies are choosing national unity through democratic means is just false. And we need a thicker conception of democracy tied to political equality to see that, where there's genuine choice. Which then brings me to the question of European democracy, because I feel like I've heard, in the discussion a lot about improving the EU in terms of its capacities to govern, increasing the role of the European Parliament, but it's not clear to me sort of where choice between genuine policy alternatives comes into this whole picture. And I just still have this worry that, the process of economic integration, founding a political order on economic integration, just undermines inherently the possibility of democratic choice between alternatives. And so I just wonder how you think about democratic choice in a system where market principles have been elevated to a constitutional ideal, which seems kind of, to go back to earlier comments, was about constraining democracy, was not about enabling democratic choice between different alternatives. So is there some inherent tension about talking about European democracy when the kind of founding principles are so geared towards constraining democratic choice?
Okay, Kinga.
I have a bit of a different take on choice actually as well, because several times you've mentioned that digital transformation is a game changer, and then you said that people in nation states are free to choose whether they opt out, for example. But we can't forget about the big technological players and the powerful tools which are not at all, it's not a pluralistic landscape. So, isn't it a common challenge that we need to somehow address, how to deal with those transformative technological tools which we probably don't understand as citizens, most of us at least.
Thank you. And Giuseppe?
It's very short and not really a question, but it's about the Spitzenkandidat and saga in 2024. Klaus, you said we will see what happens in 2024, but it seems to me that Ursula will stay, right? Is there really a space for anything?
Thank you.
I know you might not want to comment on that one.
Thank you. So back to you, please. 1, maximum 2 minutes, okay?
Klaus, I think the questions were to you.
I
totally agree with Stephen.
Yeah, maybe not the digital one, but okay. On European democracy, when you look at the parliament, let's say, is there no choice or no different policy options there? I would not agree. I mean, when you hear the leader of the GUR group from France, she has a very different offer to make. She says, basically, debt is no problem because at the end of the day, we will cancel it and we start fresh. So if people are looking for a radical choice, there is one, but it's not getting the necessary percentages. It's true, though, that this is a kind of Swiss kind of concordance democracy. You need, at the end, you need a super large coalition to be elected. Probably you need 420 members in different groups to have 353 votes, because not everybody is going to vote for you. And then the European Commission is composed as a kind of super grand coalition. But of course, if votes in the European Parliament or in the member states would massively change, that composition would change as well. But it's always looking for a balance. On digital, I can't say a lot, but on the question on 2024, I think, in fact, Ursula von der Leyen is well placed. If she applies to be a Spitzenkandidat, I think she has a good chance to be the Spitzenkandidat. And then I think she has also shown great leadership, at least on Ukraine. I think there hopefully we can agree. But I would also think, from my point of view, during COVID, so she might have a chance to be reconducted.
Any comments from Adam, from you? No? Okay then, so I guess this is a time for us to acquire our human right for coffee. But before that, I would like to thank very, very much to our panelists for the great discussion. Yeah, I think it's well deserved. And thank you very much for all your questions and comments from the room. Thank you.
I have a short announcement. Please follow to grab coffee, but about 15 minutes I will be calling you to the front of the building for a family photo. So please all respond to our calling to salmon in front of the building for photo. All are invited, so it's a broad family, not only project members.